Welcome to the Don't Tread on Anyone podcast and the Libertarian Institute. Today, I am joined by Reed Coverdale of the Naturalist Capitalist podcast. Reed, thanks so much for your time, brother.
Thanks for having me on again, Keith.
And we have Patrick McFarlane of the Libertarian Institute and the Liberty Weekly podcast. Patrick, what's happening, brother?
Hey, not much, man. Thanks for having me back.
I saw this collection of quotes in a publication by the Mises Institute. These are basically war and peace quotes by Ludwig von Mises from a collection of his work. So I thought we could read three at a time and see if they have stood the test of time. For heaven's sake, the guy was writing in like the late 40s and the 50s. English was not even his first language, so I thought we could test the Austrian master and see what he was up to, see if his ideas are still valid today. Reed, do you want to read the first three for us, and then we can discuss them?
Sure. Do you want me to read what it's from, too, or just the quote?
Not necessarily, because there's a lot of repeats from Human Action.
Okay, sure. All right, first up, we got, whoever wishes peace among people must fight statism. Modern society, based as it is on the division of labor, can be preserved only under conditions of lasting peace. The market economy involves peaceful cooperation. It bursts asunder when the citizens turn into warriors and instead of exchanging commodities and services, fight one another.
Pat, what are your first thoughts when you hear those three?
Well, the first quote basically kind of drives home this point that war itself is the final product of statism itself, because it's statism itself that is realized. So we really identify statism as being threats of violence, like a legal monopoly over the use of force, the legitimized use of force. And then so war in of itself would just be the actualization of that process. So there's this distinction between, the voluntary sphere where people are exchanging goods and both sides are benefiting, while warfare is just the absolute opposite of that. And I think that's what these three quotes really encapsulate.
Yeah, I love how he states cooperation from war, because sadly that needs clarifying. People will blame the voluntary sector for the military industrial complex funded by taxation and literally involves initiating violence against peaceful people, and they'll be like, yep, there's the free market, when it's antithetical to free market principles. And the concept of statism is always some people trying to initiate aggression against others, and those people just not resisting. So if the victim resists, it's a war. If they don't resist, it's statism. So yeah, virtually all of government is this constant, some people warring against others. Reed, any thoughts on statism, peaceful cooperation, and exchanging commodities and service as opposed to fighting one another?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that a lot of the interest in Ukraine right now has to do with politicians having relatives who are instrumental in certain areas of the gas industry in Ukraine, and there's been extortion and bribery and blackmail and things involved of that nature from the government, when if this was just a voluntary exchange, you wouldn't be having all this conflict taking place at all. So I think that just points to these quotes that once you have the state involved trying to aggress against certain people, then the voluntary exchange goes away, and then eventually you'll have conflict.
Pat, read the next three for us.
Okay, so modern war is not a war of royal armies. It is a war of the peoples, a total war. It is a war of states which do not leave to their subjects any private sphere. They consider the whole population a part of the armed forces. Whoever does not fight must work for the support and equipment of the army. Army and people are one and the same. The citizens passionately participate in the war, for it is their state, their God, who fights. What the incompatibility of war and capitalism really means, this is the next quote, is that war and high civilization are incompatible, rather. And the final quote is, society has arisen out of the works of peace. The essence of society is peacemaking. Peace and not war is the father of all things. Only economic action has created the wealth around us. Labor, not the profession of arms, brings happiness. Peace builds and war destroys.
What I love about this first one is back in the day, he also saw that people were not differentiating between the citizens of a certain geographical area and the people who claim to rule them. In other words, a criminal element within this group of people, because it was almost always seen as royal armies fighting on behalf of kings. But today, it's like Russia's at war with Ukraine. Oh, what percentage, if we merge those populations, what percentage decided to go to war? Something like 0%. I don't know what the exact number is, but it's something like 0. It's amazing, some of these. Reed, what are your thoughts on these last three?
Yeah, I really agree with what you just said. And what's ironic is even the people who do support going to war, they know nothing about the situation. They can't even find Ukraine, or some of them even Russia, on a map. They have no idea what strategic importance Ukraine holds to Russia or to NATO or to the United States, or especially specifically to them. And they're still very opinionated about it. So even the people who do want to go to war rarely have a justifiable reason to want to do so. But I think you're right that most people don't even want to at all.
That's very classic democracy. People feeling like they
Yes.
have to have an opinion on something because they have to be part of the body politic, as opposed to, you know what, I'm not sure. I don't know how to fly an airplane or give surgery, so I'm not going to. Well, you also don't know what's going on in all these different geographical areas. Heck, I hardly know. But apparently there's no humility in the religion of government. Pat, thoughts on these last three?
Yeah, and I mean, around Mises' time, you really have this idea of total war coming into being. I mean, during the First World War especially, but we see it happening as early as the Civil War. So in the 1860s, with Sherman's March to the Sea, where civilians were really becoming the target. And again, with the increase in democracy, you just have this, like Rothbard said later on, is that you have this merging between the state is us, the state and the citizenry. When that just doesn't really make any sense when you think about it. But the unfortunate result of it is that civilians become targets.
Mises continues. All the materials needed for the conduct of war must be provided by restriction of civilian consumption, by using up a part of the capital available, and by working harder. The whole burden of warring falls upon the living generation. At the breakfast table of every citizen sits in wartime an invisible guest, as it were, a GI who shares a meal. In the citizen's garage stays not only the family car, but besides, invisibly, a tank or a plane. The most important fact is that this GI needs more in food, clothing, and other things than he would use to consume as a civilian, and that military equipment wears out much quicker than civilian equipment. The costs of a modern war are enormous. Finally, men are fighting one another because they are convinced that the extermination and liquidation of adversaries is the only means of promoting their own well-being. Reed Coverdale of the Naturalist Capitalist podcast. Any thoughts on these last three?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how he points out that war does not benefit the common consumer, but it actually benefits a very wealthy few at the top who profiteer off the mass murder of people on either side of the war. It's interesting when you look through World War II and even like after World War II, a lot of the same people who, were making products in America, they were also making products in Germany. And then a lot of people who worked for the Nazis ended up working for the CIA after the war was over. So the people in power, the people making the weapons, the people making wartime supplies, they always profit and they always win, where the common man always loses.
Patrick, thoughts on the military-industrial complex and the common man bearing the cost of the burdens of war?
Yeah, it seems, to dovetail off what Reed was saying, one thing we're going to talk about later is our book recommendations. But I spoiler alert, What Have We Done is one of these books, this concept of moral injury, but it really kind of deals as well with who becomes a target, because when you talk about the morality of war itself, it seems like there's this, even in like accepted international law, there's this distinction at play between like, okay, well, when two states get together and they have conflict, then all of a sudden a different moral landscape applies, a different moral compass applies. And that's how they weave, oh, well, if we're invading soldiers in a certain area, then that's how we're going to weave civilians as being a legitimate target, because, if these soldiers are invading, then the civilians are also part of the war effort, so we have to liquidate them as well.
Oh, sure. So is that what was the title of that book?
Yeah, this one is What Have We Done? The Moral Injury of Our Longest Wars. And this, I mean, it has to do with the terror wars itself. So sorry to jump the shark here, you guys, but
that's fine. I was going to ask Reed what if he could pick one anti-war book to promote to people. What would it be?
Mine would be Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism by Scott Horton. I think it's written in a very plain language that most Americans will understand, but it also just clearly displays the insanity of what we've done over the years, and I mean, it's just an insane mixture of stupidity and evil. I mean, there were intentional decisions made that would cause intentional blowback, and then there were other decisions that were made that were just straight up stupid. So anyone who hasn't quite accepted that the foreign policy establishment and the military industrial complex don't really have it all together, I think they should read that book and probably change their minds.
So I know that you two focus quite a bit on this foreign policy aspect, much more than the average person. I had a video asking people to guess how many bombs they think America dropped in 2016. The significance is this was the last time we had a cool, trendy winner of the Nobel Peace Prize in office, whereas Trump is like this evil brute, was set up was pushed in by the Russians, so he doesn't even really count. So I go, I'll give you a real legitimate president, and I want you guys to guess how many bombs they dropped that year. So this is according to CFR.org. Patrick, if you had to guess, how many bombs did the United States drop in 2016?
I mean, I might have seen this, but I think it's around 10,000.
And Reed, if you had to guess, how many bombs would you say the United States dropped in 2016?
I believe it's 26,000, but I'm not sure.
Well, that is why I do so much work, because people like Reed know the answer.
Damn.
So
I was
the
off
answer
by 172. Come on, I wasn't perfect.
So you can see CFR.org. The reason this is important is the Council on Foreign Relations has almost supported every intervention since, I don't know, the Franco-Prussian War. I mean, every single time there's a war, they can find a justification. So briefly, Syria, 12,000, Iraq, 12,000, Afghanistan, 1,300, Libya, 496, Yemen, 35, Somalia, 14, Pakistan, 3. And they even mention in this that these numbers are a little off because one, quote, bomb can include a number of precision strikes. There was, oh my gosh, this article is just so evil. They said, whether this strategy works, i.e. reduces the threat posed by extremists operating from these countries, improves overall security and governance on the ground, is highly contested. So they don't know if all the people they murder and the trillions of dollars they spend are actually improving the well-being of these countries or making America more safe. There's a lot of evidence to say it creates terrorists and makes us less safe. My favorite part, though, is threat posed by extremists. You see, it's not extreme to drop 26,000 bombs and kill a ton of civilians, but entering the Capitol building without permission, that is just really, really extreme. And I can't believe that ever happened. Oh, that's so terrible. I think I need another investigation.
Now, Keith, what I'd like to know is how many U.S. manufactured bombs were dropped in 2016.
That will have to be for someone in the comment section to inform us on.
Also, I think so. That's the last year Obama was president, And did not Trump drop more bombs in 4 years than Obama did in 8? Is that correct?
I have heard that. I'd heard that a number of years ago. I don't have anything concrete in front of me. But this article, I clicked on every link and read through all of their sources. That's why I felt comfortable plugging it in this one. But yeah, I mean, Trump, while he bragged about not starting any others, he never mentioned, I also didn't intensify any. So you think, well, yeah, that might be something you want to clarify as well. But back to the great wisdom of Ludwig von Mises. Reed, if you could please start with, where are we? It's this one right here.
The existence of the existence of the armaments industries is a consequence of the warlike spirit, not its cause. What basis for war could there still be once all peoples had been set free? The liberal thinks otherwise. He is convinced that victorious war is an evil even for the victor, that peace is always better than war. He demands no sacrifice from the stronger, but only that he should come to realize where his true interests lie and learn to understand that peace is for him, the stronger, just as advantageous as it for the worker. For the weaker.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? It also hurts the strong as well. If you look at all the empires, whether it's the Japanese Empire, the German Empire, the Russian Empire before the Soviet Union, the British Empire, and sadly the American Empire, it's always war that brings these people down. They always get bled to bankruptcy and either have to tax a ton and not be productive, or they have to drastically inflate the currency and impoverish themselves this way. Pay for these empires. Patrick, on these last three.
Yeah, go up to the first one because I think that's a direct endorsement of recreational nuclear weapons. So it's the armaments industry is a consequence of the warlike spirit, not its cause. So by that logic, recreational nukes, not an issue for war and peace. So I think that's all I got.
Reed, any thoughts on the warlike spirit and the armaments industries and hurting the strong as well as the weak?
Yeah, well, that middle quote there says, what case for war would there be if men were set free or something along that line? I think that's a very important point here, too. If the government got out of the way, there would be more freedom, there would be more flourishing, people would be happier, people would be able to trade with each other. But since they restrict that, people have more miserable lives and they're easier to control because they're angry and they're desperate. And you get into situations like we are now in the United States where our economy has been completely destroyed and we're looking for an external enemy. And that's happened in history before, and that doesn't tend to bring countries to good conclusions when their economy falls apart and they start finding foreign entities to blame their problems on. But that's kind of where we are now. And like you said, it ruins everybody in the country except for the weapons manufacturers. Like I said, they win the war no matter what.
Exactly. Yeah, this is a very valuable point here. We certainly see that war is the health of the state, that anytime there's a war, the state can justify actions it otherwise would have a very difficult time persuading the populace on. For example, I need a ton of power. Well, why the hell do you need that? It's like, well, because of the evil Germans and the evil Russians and the evil Al-Qaeda. Okay, well, now people will give it up. But also the inverse is true, that the state is the health of war. So when I am swiping someone else's credit card or I'm sending other people's kids off to die and I don't have the legal repercussions of, murder being recognized, because if you murder en masse, it's just called foreign policy. Well, then in all of these cases, you see that the state is the health of war. That having a state that doesn't have moral standards, that has its own magical money printing machine that no one else has, that gets the right to conscript. There's conscription in both Ukraine and Russia and America until the 70s. around the time of Milton Friedman. So again, so long as we have this state, we're constantly going to have this rent-seeking incentive of people to occupy it and go to war with their enemies. I think he was just so insightful. That book specifically is called Nation, State, and Economy. That one I have not read. Patrick, start us off.
Wars, foreign and domestic, revolutions, civil wars are more likely to be avoided the closer the division of labor binds men. The pacifist line of argument goes too far if it simply denies that a people can gain by war. War is the alternative to freedom of foreign investment as realized by the international capital market.
Yeah, whenever I see those, when I think of pacifism, a lot of people think it's just step back and let murderers do whatever they want. My understanding is you don't go in search of monsters to find, but you have no problem responding to aggressors. As Mark Passio says, cause no harm, take no shit is the correct line of thinking. Pat, any thoughts on these three?
What about Bob Murphy? I've never actually listened to Bob give his pacifism argument, and I don't know if that's the non-aggression principle or not.
Yeah, I think, Pat, that Bob just says it's uneconomic to engage in such activities. So a Rothbardian society or any society that didn't have a recognized state would not use aggression in that sense. They would more or less hedge their bets economically.
I see. Oh, so they could go ahead and like take care of it even by not participating in the conflict at all?
I believe so. Yeah. Just simply the costs are so astronomical, and the amount of power concentration it takes to exert those costs, for example, a prison system, some people locking others up, is just so costly that it's just not worth engaging in it at all. So I believe that was his point when he debated Tom Woods.
Good old Bob Murphy. Well, the last one I think is incredibly important, especially as it stands right now, because I truly believe that the new Cold War with China is one of the most dangerous things that we're currently experiencing, and I think that avoiding that is one of the most pressing issues for the liberty movement to pursue and warn everyone about. And right now, there's this great narrative going on, especially in the populist right, that we need an economic decoupling from China. And I think that's incredibly dangerous. And judging off of Mises's quote here, I think it backs that up. War is the alternative to freedom of foreign investment as realized by the international capital market. So the more that we trade with China, the less likely that a conflict is to occur. And that kind of goes to the situation and relationship between China and Taiwan right now. I mean, Taiwan, I believe, is China's second largest trading partner. So if they're going to go and blow the whole island up and invade it, well, they're going to lose all that revenue. So I wrote about that recently, but Peter Van Buren has wrote about it more extensively than I have. I believe for Responsible Statecraft. Not sure. So anyways, that's my take.
Read Coverdale. Any response to the division of labor, people gaining by war, and foreign investment?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting in that first quote is the idea that war is less likely the more a division of labor binds men. And I used to work on power lines where you had crews of large people working together, and you'd be shoulder to shoulder with some guy that you might disagree with completely on politics and foreign policy or whatever, religion, but it didn't matter because you were both working together trying to achieve a common goal. So you'd kind of put everything aside. And what I've noticed is people who work more white collar jobs, it's easier for them to otherize people who aren't in the same category they are, because they're more of a computer screen to them than an actual man standing in a trench digging next to them. And it seems like the more our society goes in that direction, the more digitized everything becomes, the less hands-on it is, the less interactive with people, the easier it is to demonize entire swaths of people from other places or people who think differently. I mean, you're seeing it in our own country, like you were talking about earlier with January 6th. Those are the crazy extremists that need to be put down. I think that's so possible because of how digital an age we're living in, and I think that it's only going to get worse. And the more desensitized we become to violence, the more desensitized we become to hatred, the harder it is going to be to fight this. So obviously, the more we trade, the more we work with, and the more we just interact with people from other countries, from other religions, from other political backgrounds, the more peace there's going to be.
From Ludwig von Mises' Human Action, the statement that one man's boon is another man's damage is valid with regard to robbery, war, and booty. The robber's plunder is the damage of the despoiled victim, but war and commerce are two different things. The philosophy of protectionism is a philosophy of war. The wars of our age are not at variance with popular economic doctrines. They are, on the contrary, the inescapable result of consistent application of these doctrines. Finally, what has transformed the limited war between royal armies into total war, the clash between peoples, is not technicalities of military art, but the substitution of the welfare state for the laissez-faire state. Patrick McFarlane of the Liberty Weekly podcast. Thoughts on these Mises quotes?
Yeah, let's go. I mean, the second quote really kind of touches on what I said with China and Taiwan. But the last quote, let's read that again because I don't think I quite grasp it in first reading. So, war has transformed the limited war between royal armies into total war. The clash between peoples is not technicalities of military art, but the substitution of the welfare state for the laissez-faire state.
So if my general outlook on the world is I don't deserve anything from anyone unless I can voluntarily get it from them. I don't deserve a second of their time. I don't deserve a penny of their income unless I can voluntarily get it from them. That is the laissez-faire capitalist free market ideology. But the welfare state ideology is people owe me stuff. And more or less anything that someone has, they've either inherited it or they've got it through exploitation. This is the welfare state mindset that allows things like war to take place both domestically through civil wars like the French Revolution and wars between nations. It makes it much more likely than they otherwise would be. That's what I take away from it. Granted, this was on page 820 of Human Action, so maybe there were some things preceding it, and I'm totally wrong. But that's what I think.
Wait, so I hope I'm not being stupid here, but is he saying that substituting the welfare state for the laissez-faire capitalist state is what has transformed limited war into total war?
Yes.
Saying that the bigger the welfare state, the more people identify with the government, the more they see democracy as legitimate, and they see other countries as being representative of their domestic populations. So the bigger the welfare state, the more likely I am to say those goddamn Germans deserve what they got at Dresden.
Okay.
That's
I'm
my
reading it the other way. I don't know if I'm wrong here.
Let us know in the comments section below. Or please DM me. DMs are always open, and those give me tons of material for future videos. Read Coverdale. Thoughts on the last three Mises quotes. All are from Human Action.
Yeah, if you could go to the third one too, because that one was the one that stuck out to me. And I agree. I think it's saying what you're saying it says, because I agree with your analysis that if you believe in extortion, if you believe in the forceful seizure of something that is somebody else's to better yourself, then it's not hard to make the leap from your personal well-being to your nation's well-being. And that's why it would transform from royal armies to total war, because the welfare state is an all-encroaching system that everybody takes part in. So if everybody is used to that idea of extortion, of theft, then thinking that that is okay or even virtuous to a certain extent, it's not a huge leap to think that, if if Saudi Arabia is not going to keep selling us oil, we need to, do regime change there or something. So I don't know. I just think that's an interesting thought I'd never really put together.
At least open up the goddamn Keystone Pipeline. I mean, for the least you could do is allow capitalist acts between consenting adults. Once you've now gotten Russia on our bad side and have been driving Putin into the arms of Xi for the last 30 years by expanding NATO into 13 countries that not only were former Soviet countries, but were part of the previous Russian Empire in the 1800s. Just absolutely unbelievable, the matches that they play with, knowing that...
Yeah, but we need our coal-powered Teslas to protect the environment, don't you know, Keith?
We really do. Reed, as someone who has read Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism by Scott Horton, the only time that NATO, the North American Treaty Organization, again, it's a military treaty, not a trade organization, when you look at the very first time that NATO ever invoked Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all, was after September 11th into Afghanistan. Would you say that the U.S. Military response, along with the NATO response in Afghanistan, was a net benefit or a net cost?
Definitely a net cost. I mean, how many trillion did we spend in Afghanistan anyway? I don't really know that off the top of my head.
We'll never know. Something like it was in the trillions after 20 years.
Thousands of lives, trillions of dollars. And then with our, with our exit last year, I don't think anyone looked at that as successful. And I mean, you guys might agree with me, but in the general public, I'm definitely a minority when I'm sad that people had to die in our exit from Afghanistan. But as far as optics go, I was actually very glad that it was such a catastrophe from, a public standpoint, that people were kind of embarrassed to see how horribly it was executed, because I think it was very reflective of our entire involvement over there. So yeah, nothing but a disaster. Absolutely, completely negative outcome from being there.
Pat, if you're looking at, or assume you're talking to someone who says, well, 9/11 happened and we haven't had major terrorist attacks like 9/11 since U.S. NATO involvement in Afghanistan. So therefore, NATO and U.S. involvement in Afghanistan has been a net benefit. Pat, what do you say to that mindset?
Well, I think it's emblematic of what the foreign policy consensus is. I remember a few years ago I was reading something in Foreign Affairs saying basically this, that, oh, well, over the last, 40 years, NATO has presided over, or since World War II, NATO has presided over world peace, and that NATO is the cause of world peace, being the implication. And I think it just completely is an Orwellian distortion of exactly what we're seeing here. But specifically with that, I mean, you'd have to get into what the history of, the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks and the role of the Taliban and who we went after exactly, seeing that, and then you'd have to get into blowback and things like that too. I realize what's wrong with that last quote. I'm sorry, is I'm reading for as by in that last substitution of the welfare state by the laissez-faire state. I think it's a bad translation of the German anyways.
Very possible. Yeah, it's too sad that Scott Horton in Enough Already cites the fact that he actually uses the citation from a CIA analyst that in September of 2001, there were about 400 members of this organization known as Al-Qaeda. This was Abdullah Azzam, Ayman al-Zawahiri, and Osama bin Laden's group in the Middle East. There were about 400 members in 2001. And after the 20-year war that's cost trillions of dollars, killed tons of civilians, and given a ton of people PTSD, there is more Al-Qaeda than ever before. And they have bigger reach in places like Libya with the Libyan Islamic fighting group, in places like Syria with Jabhat al-Nusra, even places in the Philippines and Niger, or Nigeria, I believe. So it absolutely devastating. And the fact that they don't have any humility, they're not even like, well, maybe we should question war with a nuclear power and a no-fly zone, considering the Taliban we lost to in 11 days after we left. No humility at all. That's what statism does to your brain, and it's terrible. You lose all standards for the people you pledge your allegiance to. It's really, really devastating. Reed Coverdale, could you start us on these next three?
Under laissez-faire, peaceful coexistence of a multitude of sovereign nations is possible. Under government control of business, it is impossible. Boy, they need some commas in that sentence. That was tough. In the long run, war and the preservation of market economy are incompatible. Capitalism is essentially a scheme for peaceful nations. But this does not mean that a nation which is forced to repel foreign aggressors must substitute government control for private enterprise. If it were to do this, it would deprive itself of the most efficient means of defense. There is no record of a socialist nation which defeated a capitalist nation. In spite of their much glorified war socialism, the Germans were defeated in both world wars. The emergence of the international division of labor requires the total abolition of war.
So, Reed, when you read these last three discussing war and the preservation of the market economy, depriving people of their most efficient means of defense if they give the state too much power, what are some thoughts that come to mind?
Yeah, it's interesting. The countries that took over the most of their economies to run on warfare, they all eventually lose, and more quickly than countries that don't necessarily convert everything to warfare. I mean, and it says, what does it say there? That no socialist nation has ever defeated a capitalist nation. That's something I've never thought about, but that's still true today, isn't it?
I think the greater degree, so if we're taking Hoppe's definition of socialism, a greater institutionalized aggression against private property, whereas capitalism is a greater recognition of the institution of private property and voluntary exchange, that more capitalist countries would tend to beat more socialist countries. Yet, it would be hard to distinguish just because of the amount of guerrilla warfare that's involved. That is one that I might have to think about.
Yeah, in spite of their much glorified war socialism, the Germans were defeated in both world wars. That's a good line right there.
So yeah, if I just have an end that I want to be more productive in the field of armaments and my ability to defend myself, I certainly want the high amount of options that a capitalist free market economy would give me, rather than a state-controlled one where there not only were regulations, I probably wouldn't be recognized as having a right to purchase some things and not others. And there'd be one monopoly security agency called the state. There wouldn't be competing ones trying to protect me, knowing they could lose my business if they didn't protect me. So it's absolutely possible, but this is the only one that I will more or less raise an eyebrow at. Pat, thought on these last three?
Yeah, it kind of gets into, I mean, Mises is known for his critique of socialism being the calculation problem. And of course, if you're trying to, arrange all of the instruments of the market economy into one end, which is warfare, then you just have a single buyer for all these weapons. And therefore, it would seem like you would have a pricing problem if there's just one singular demand. But I wanted to point out that there was an issue with commas in something that Reed said. So we're just going to spend this whole time crapping on whoever made this this translation. And I was thinking in the original quote that Mises
Mark Thornton?
some kind of profound point or something like that he was saying, something about the laissez-faire economy. I don't think it was Mark Thornton. I don't think he translated it. I think he just arranged this. I'm talking about the original Human Action quotes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I got a question about World War II. I know we obviously had a ton of government intervention in the U.S. economy during World War II, but was our production much more laissez-faire than Germany or Russia? Because, I also know we had a lot of natural resources in the United States, but it's ridiculous how quickly the United States jumped into war production and had airplanes and tanks and I feel like there's a lot of misinformation around World War II saying that the Nazis had the best army, because they really didn't. The Nazi Germany moved a lot of its artillery with horses all the way through the war. They had bolt action rifles. They did have some like crazy scientific discoveries toward the end of the war, like they had jet engines and things like that, but mostly they were pretty technologically impaired compared to us. Do either of you guys know much about that?
Yeah, certainly. In the works of Anthony Sutton, who was a researcher at the Hoover Institute, he wrote 2 books called Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, as well as Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, which is where you can have both of these parasites called National Socialism in Germany, International Socialism in Russia, and Democratic Socialism or social democracy in the form of America, so long as you have this capitalist engine that you can sort of siphon off of. So Anthony Sutton wrote a 3-volume work specifically on Soviet Russia, but also places in National Socialist Germany, teaming with places like IBM and IG Farben, that's where they got a lot of their strength from. So I'm not exactly sure what percentage of the economies of America versus Britain versus Germany in the First and Second World War existed. But it all goes back to critiques that Adam Smith was making when he was criticizing the concept of mercantilism, where he said that businesses and the state are constantly colluding against the consumer, not because businesses want this total free market, because in a free market, businesses would face competition, whereas when they can invoke regulations and protectionism, well, then they don't have to necessarily meet consumer demand. It's not necessarily they don't get $1 out of your pocket unless you give it to them. They have a direct line to a few politicians who are happy to write them legislation in their favor. So all throughout the world wars, my understanding from the work of Anthony Sutton is that America was constantly having companies bankroll these large institutions. Pat, do you have anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to talk about the role of the CFR and IG Farben specifically, like between World War I and World War II. I started writing a piece on this, but you just have lots of investment being driven by CFR members to create World War II, essentially with the Treaty of Versailles and the restitution package that they put together from Germany, from the Weimar Republic to France and all these other nations. So kind of creating that. You have CFR men, and I think it was J.P. Morgan too that was involved with this financing project, but creating this impossible situation and people from those banking institutions creating it essentially.
Yeah, the Sutton books that I was thinking of, one is titled National Suicide, and that's a summary of his work, but the other is titled Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development, 1917 to 1990. It's in 3 different volumes, and it's just incredible. Pat, would you mind reading these next ones?
Yeah, modern war is merciless. It does not spare pregnant women or infants. It is indiscriminate killing and destroying. It does not respect the rights of neutrals. Millions are killed, enslaved, or expelled from the dwelling places in which their ancestors lived for centuries. Nobody can foretell what will happen in the next chapter of this endless struggle. This has little to do with the atomic bomb. The root of the evil is not the construction of new, more dreadful weapons. It is the spirit of conquest itself. It is probable that scientists will discover some methods of defense against the atomic bomb, but this will not alter things. It will merely prolong for a short time the process of the complete destruction of civilization. Well, that's promising. That's inspiring. To defeat the aggressors is not enough to make peace durable. The main thing is to discard the ideology that generates war. Ownership turns the fighting man into the economic man. Only the exclusion of private property can maintain the military character of the state. Only the warrior who has no other occupation apart from war than preparation for war is always ready for war. Men occupied in affairs may wage wars of defense, but not long wars of conquest.
Reed Coverdale, any thoughts on those last three?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought experiment to ask people which they think was worse, the Holocaust or World War II, because something like 10 times the amount of people died in World War II that died in the Holocaust. So, and so many innocent people on both sides, who were just murdered in cities or firebombed or machine gunned down or whatever. And the same with what was worse, the Civil War or the institution of slavery, even though the Civil War wasn't to end slavery. But, when you start asking people about these things, I feel like a lot of them, they're not even necessarily thinking it was a horrible price that had to be paid to stop these things. They're thinking this isn't as bad as the thing that was going on in the first place. And I think this is really interesting because that's the way I used to think. I used to not think World War II was horrible. I used to think it was a noble cause that just had to be fought to stop Hitler from taking over the world and committing mass murder on all, 6 inhabited continents or whatever. And that's a big transformation I've gone through over the years. And I think it was that first quote that really spoke to that about the murder of, where's the quote there? Is it the one on the top right now? No. Yeah, that one. Modern war is merciless. It does not spare pregnant women or infants. It is indiscriminate killing and destroying. I don't think people, it's weird how people always focus on the atomic bombs dropped on Japan, which was horrible, but they forget about firebombing Tokyo for months ahead of that, killing many more people in a much more terrible way, or the firebombing of Germany. I mean, the stuff that went on during that war and every war since is just absolutely horrific, and innocent people die. They burn to death. They get killed in the crossfire. They get accidentally targeted. And I think people just forget about that. We have a very romanticized vision of what war is. And it's not what we have come to think it is.
Exactly. It's always so vague. It's always, we defeated the enemy. It's never tons of women and children and innocent guys died. A lot of the guys who died in combat were conscripts, and they thought they were doing the right thing, just like the other people were, because they were tricked by their ruling class, who they were brought up to pledge their allegiance to. Well, once you realize how complex it is, then you don't see things as black and white, because only once you see things in black and white are you able to say, oh yeah, let's bomb the hell out of them. Yeah, let's just murder those Branch Davidians. God, do they deserve it by now? 51 days? God, I hope they all suffer. Only at that point could you get people to think in such a tragic way. Pat, any thoughts on the three quotes you read there?
I'll focus on the first one too, because I think it's important that Mises says the root of the evil is not the construction of new, more dreadful weapons. It is the spirit of conquest itself. But yet at the same time, Mises doesn't say that we could get rid of that. And I think that if Mises was saying we could get rid of the spirit of conquest, he would be more like a Marxist, saying that we need to create a new man, a new non-violent man. I think the truth is more complicated, is that while the vast majority of people, and I've done work about this, but the vast majority of people would not kill in war. In fact, they have to be conditioned to do so. They would die rather than kill another person, or they would die even if it meant saving their friends. They'd refuse to kill even if it meant saving their friend. But there is 10 to 15% of the population that are sociopaths or psychopaths, and they will always exist.
10 to 15%. Really?
Okay, it's less than that, maybe like 5.
I was gonna say I'd support India's system of putting a dot on your head instead. If you're married, if you're a psychopath, I mean, but God, if it's 10-15%,
No, I mixed
gotta
up.
change where I shop.
I mixed up the statistics. The statistic is that 80% of people will not use their weapons in combat at all, and 15 to 20% will. But of that 15 to 20%, most of them will purposely not shoot the enemy and will miss and will posture. But there is a small percentage, which is probably like 1 to 2%, of men who will kill without remorse.
Thank heavens. From Mises, Omnipotent Government, page 3. Within a world of free trade and democracy, there are no incentives for war and conquest. Only in the case of primitive peoples does war lead to the selection of the stronger and more gifted, and that among civilized peoples it leads to a deterioration of the race by unfavorable selection. The only means to lasting peace is to remove the root causes of war. Read Coverdale. Thoughts on any of those three?
That middle one is interesting. I need to read it again. Only in the case of primitive peoples does war lead to the selection of the stronger and more gifted, and that among civilized peoples it leads to deterioration of the race by unfavorable selection. So he's suggesting that war was maybe necessary at one time along the evolutionary path, but we've evolved past it and now it's a negative. That's kind of how I'm reading that.
I'm thinking that if we are in a very primitive tribe, the strongest are absolutely needed, as in physical strength, and they're going to be the ones who we need in case of war. But now, what, Bill Kristol and John McCain, you think they could beat anyone in an arm wrestling match? No. Right. Today, it's the intellectuals who are able to manipulate the consciousness of the masses who are provoking war, not the physically strong, the physically ambitious, or emotionally ambitious as well. So the people pushing for war back then versus the people pushing for war nowadays are two very different demographics.
Yeah,
Pat,
I think that's right. Yeah.
Pat, any thoughts on these last three?
No.
Mises goes on. He says, but what is needed for a satisfactory solution of the burning problem of international relations is neither a new office with more committees, secretaries, commissioners, reports, and regulations, nor a new body of armored executioners, but the radical overthrow of mentalities and domestic policies which must result in conflict. Full freedom of movement of persons and goods, the most comprehensive protection of the property and freedom of each individual, removal of all state compulsion in the school system, in short, the most exact and complete application of the ideas of 1789 are the prerequisites of peaceful conditions. If you want to abolish war, you must eliminate its causes. What is needed to restrict government activities to the preservation of life, health, and private property, and thereby to safeguard the working of the market. Sovereignty must not be used for inflicting harm on anyone, whether citizen or foreigner. We got a couple more here. I'm just going to go through these. If some peoples pretend that history or geography gives them the right to subjugate other races, nations, or peoples, there can be no peace. Only one thing can conquer war, that liberal attitude of mind, which can see nothing in war but destruction and annihilation, and which can never wish to bring about a war because it regards war as injurious even to the victors. Finally, if war is regarded as advantageous, then laws will not be allowed to stand in the way of going to war. On the first day of any war, all the laws opposing obstacles to it will be swept aside. Read Coverdale. Thoughts on any of the previous quotes from Mises?
Well, I think the kind of all-encapsulating concept here is just let people live and let them trade with each other and let them interact with each other, and it'll be harder for them to want to murder each other. And if you look at governments, they basically do everything they can to segregate people, to separate people by race, religion, ideology of any sort, and make people hate each other based on which country they're from. So if the government is just not there doing that, like Patrick was talking about a couple minutes ago, most men don't have an inherent desire to actually shoot at somebody. You have to be forced into that mindset. So if we just let people live, wars probably are not just going to naturally spring up.
Pat, thoughts on the last Mises quotes?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't put it a better way myself. I think, Dave Smith and Reed, you said this earlier too, is that when you're cooperating with someone, you learn to rely on them, and you work together to reach a goal, and that cooperation leads to less conflict.
Reed, when Bill Kristol debated Scott Horton, he said, "I'm also anti-war. In fact, I only justify some U.S. military intervention because I think it will lead to less war than more war." So, Reed, when you say you are anti-war, what does that mean?
I think war is the worst thing that has ever plagued humanity. And I mean the worst thing. It should be the absolute last resort. I mean, nothing else. It should be. It should precede nothing else. It should be the absolute last resort when you have no other options and you're just defending yourself. And I can't think of a single U.S. intervention that resembles that template at all. And also, I'm not much of a statist or a collectivist myself. So when I'm thinking of self-defense, it's if there were an invasion into this country where people were trying to burn my property and hurt my family, I would defend myself. But being anti-war is just realizing that it is the worst thing that has ever existed and that it should be avoided at all costs.
Patrick McFarlane of the Liberty Weekly podcast, libertyweekly.net, where can be found. Patrick, what does it mean to be anti-war?
Yeah, likewise. I mean, war is absolutely the worst thing that happens. And I want to say it's completely avoidable. Obviously, there are examples where we were just talking about that, where Mises was talking about this need for human conquest. So unfortunately, I don't think it'll ever go away. But I think that it takes people like us to speak out against it and to try and make everyone realize that there are far more people that will not kill and take other human life. So if we just all got together and collectively said no, maybe that might make a difference. So we're here trying to do that work, especially at this time where I think it's very, very sorely needed as the propaganda machine ramps up.
Yes, I definitely think that the great crime in war is not that, well, I secretly love Putin and I really like the head of the Taliban. They're all politicians. I couldn't care if they live or died. Actually, I have a preference. Don't ask me which one it is. The point is that the great crime in war is imprecision. It's not that, well, I'm against guilty people who are responsible for murder and torture. I'm against them being held accountable. No, of course. The reason that I'm against war, or what Mises here has called total war, is because of its imprecision. It conscripts people by the millions and more or less enslaves them into the worst work you could possibly be enforced to labor to. It gives tons of people PTSD. It takes husbands away from mothers. It takes fathers away from kids. It gets people's limbs blown off unnecessarily, who aren't necessarily guilty of any wrongdoing. So it's not that I kind of have a soft spot for Putin. It's I kind of have a soft spot for Ukrainians and Russians and Americans and anyone who hasn't initiated fraud or violence against anyone else. Yeah, excellent points there about being anti-war. And Bill Crystal owes us an apology for lying. Patrick McFarlane, read the next four for us, please.
All right. So the way to eternal peace does not lead through strengthening state and central power, as socialism strives for. History has witnessed the failure of many endeavors to impose peace by war, cooperation by coercion, unanimity by slaughtering dissidents. A lasting order cannot be established by bayonets. War can really cause no economic boom, at least not directly, since an increase in wealth never does result from destruction of goods.
And read one more for us.
Not through war and victory, but only through work can a nation create the preconditions for the well-being of its members. Conquering nations finally perish either because they are annihilated by strong ones or because the ruling class is culturally overwhelmed by the subjugated.
Reed, could you please finish us off by reading the final few quotes here?
Economically considered, war and revolution are always bad business. The essence of so-called war prosperity. It enriches some by what it takes from others. It is not rising wealth, but a shifting of wealth and income. There is but one field of public administration in which the criterion of success or failure is unquestionable, the waging of war. But even here, the only thing certain is whether the operation has been crowned with success. War socialism was by no means complete socialism, but it was full and true socialization without exception if one had kept on the path that had been taken. War prosperity is like the prosperity that an earthquake or a plague brings. The earthquake means good business for construction workers, and cholera improves the business of physicians, pharmacists, and undertakers, but no one has for that reason yet sought to celebrate earthquakes and cholera as stimulators of the productive forces in the general interest. Wow, that's a great one right there. Interventionism generates economic nationalism, and economic nationalism generates I don't know this Bella what is this word?
Bellicosity.
Bellicosity. My dad's an English teacher, he'd be ashamed. If men and commodities are prevented from crossing the borderlines, why should not the armies try to pave the way for them?
So, Reed, what about the cholera quote from Nation State and Economy? Did you think it was so significant?
Well, it was like I was saying earlier, the arms manufacturers and the people making the tanks and the bombs and the machinery, they always win, right? They're the ones who win in a war. They make millions of dollars and tons of profit. And then even if their country loses a war, they get employed by whoever ends up beating them. So they just never lose. And they're like the undertakers, the doctors, the pharmacists, and the construction workers in earthquakes and cholera outbreaks.
Patrick McFarlane, any thoughts on these, the last set of Mises quotes? Gosh, he discussed so much here. He went into nationalism, interventionism, prosperity being like an earthquake, channeling Frederick Bastiat here, enriching some by what it takes from others. God, there's so much here. Pat, final thoughts here.
Yeah, I mean, war is just another big government program, and that's why, like the folks at antiwar.com, it's Randolph Bourne, driven by that war is the health of the state. It's just a big government program. It's a program of redistribution, essentially. And I think that the quote that Reed pointed out, I love it too, because it's such a good illustration that's easy to grasp. And the imagery that it brings to mind it really works.
So when having this discussion with people about the concept of war, there is one war that constantly comes up in any English-speaking country, Even in Russian-speaking countries that I have recently come to learn, that is the Second World War. Now, first of all, this is kind of odd. First, you would think that the war that they'd brag about would be a war that lasted like a very short amount of time, killed very few innocent people. It mainly focused on the guilty people and was a great success for the good of mankind. But what they focus on is the Second World War, which killed a lot of people. So Pat Buchanan had summarized his findings after having researched the Second World War. Remember, Pat Buchanan was someone who supported George Kennan's containment philosophy and domino theory. So Pat Buchanan supported the war in Korea, Vietnam, Grenada, Nicaragua, Afghanistan in the 1980s. So this is not some libertarian who is just constantly questioning things. Here is Pat Buchanan on the Second World War. On September 1st, 1939, 70 years ago, the German army crossed the Polish frontier. On September 3rd, Britain declared war. 6 years later, 50 million Christians and Jews had perished. Britain was broken and bankrupt. Germany, a smoldering ruin. Europe had served as the site of the most murderous combat known to man, and civilians had suffered worse horrors than the soldiers. By May 1945, Red Army hordes occupied all the great capitals of Central Europe: Vienna, Prague, Budapest, Berlin. 100 million Christians were under the heel of the most barbarous tyranny in history, the Bolshevik regime of the greatest terrorist of them all, Joseph Stalin. What cause could justify these sacrifices? Read Coverdale. Please explain where people can find the Naturalist Capitalist podcast, and any thoughts on the Second World War and the quotes of Ludwig von Mises.
Yeah, the Second World War is the worst conflict in human history, and I think this is why we learn so much about the Holocaust in high school, and why Nazis are so inundated into our culture as the most evil thing that's ever existed, because until recently, now Putin's worse than Nazis. But before that, Nazis are always like the epitome of evil. And I think it was just drilled into our brain because we had to believe that, what is it, like 77 million people died in World War II. The estimates go up that high, I think, something like that. So we had to think that nuking Japan and leveling half of Europe and, the Battle of Stalingrad and all these things were all worth it, because this was going to be a plague on humanity that was just going to destroy the world. But yeah, my podcast is the Naturalist Capitalist podcast. You can find me on YouTube, Odyssey, Spotify, Apple Podcasts under the Naturalist Capitalist. And then you can follow me, Read Coverdale, on Twitter, Instagram, Gab, Getter, Float, all those places. I'm the only Read Coverdale out there and the only Naturalist Capitalist out there. So if you look for me, you'll find me.
I should have chosen a different name. There's a black cartoonist, SJW, by the name of Keith Knight. And I really wish I would have gone with something else. Reed, last time you and I spoke, you had told people they should check out the Mike Rivera podcast that you did with him. He has done so much excellent work, and I've gone to his site so many times in my past. When it comes to foreign policy or the economics of foreign policy or just the costs of wars in general, what is a podcast or video that people should check out if they only have time for one? Which one of your podcasts should they check out?
Man, if it's going to involve economics and also political motivation, I'm gonna say two because I can't choose one. But I did the Ukrainian situation. I believe it's episode 195 with Scott Horton, and I did this before Russia invaded Ukraine. It was a week or two before, and we went into the entire history with Crimea, with the Donbass region, with Luhansk and Donetsk, and just covered it all. And then another one that I did about a week ago is Corn Pop's Ukrainian Revenge with Ryan Dawson. It's a great episode. We go into U.S. politicians' involvement with energy companies in Ukraine, and we kind of dig into more of the history of Ukraine and Russia, and the evil of our own government and the financial interests that are really propelling this war. So I would recommend both. I can't really choose between either of those.
Links to both of those will be in the description below. Patrick McFarlane of LibertyWeekly.net. My audience knows where to find you at both that website and the Libertarian Institute. Final thoughts on the quotes we read from Mises and the Second World War, the single war glorified by the CFR and all of their friends.
Yeah, like Reed said, I mean, I think it's most important for the powers that shouldn't be to make it that World War II is the glorious war, that we are the heroes. And I think that's directly because it was the most horrible thing to ever happen. And so therefore the narrative has to be completely captured so that people think that these things are absolutely necessary, because otherwise they would look at the cost. And I think that we would have focused more on that in school, about all the death and destruction that occurred, not just because of how evil Nazism was, but because of the conflagration and the conflict itself. So I think it's important, especially in these times, to look to what Mises and Rothbard actually said, and to look to people like Hoppe and all these different philosophers that we talk about all the time, but to really try to see this conflict through that lens, but to get it right. Damn it! I mean, it's so important to be right at the right time, and I think that as this has really caused a lot of people to kind of lose their minds. It's like COVID all over again, except in a different way. So I think that we really just need to get this right, and to see these things with nuance, because foreign policy is hard, and I find it to be harder than actually studying the philosophy. I mean, we've been doing non-aggression principle podcasts for almost a decade now. They've been all over the place, and they're good. But at the same time, foreign policy, I think it's more important to apply those principles to foreign policy and get the right answer. And I think it's more challenging. So that's what I've been trying to focus on lately. And it's difficult. I mean, it's not easy because you need all this other background information. So you can find my work at libertyweekly.net, Libertarian Institute. If I could direct people to one work that I did, it would be Why Can't Johnny Kill? I titled it 11th Hour Conscientious Objection and Moral Injury. That's libertyweekly.net/178. I wrote a little article about it, but it's a short documentary talking about the statistics that I flubbed earlier, sociopathy and moral injury, but moreover, what makes people kill, because most people won't kill. And so we talk about that in that documentary.
Thanks to everyone for watching the Libertarian Institute and the Don't Tread on Anyone podcast. Reed Coverdale and Patrick McFarlane. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for your time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
The American people, you need to understand, this is just a money laundering operations. I mean, 10 years of a war in Afghanistan for us to leave. We couldn't even take back the billions of dollars worth of weapons and we just left them on the soil for the Taliban to take over. I mean, every single American should be outraged. And that's why I say that we have to remain focused and understand the enemies for us, for the American people, are not in Ukraine or Russia. They are sitting down in Congress on Capitol Hill. Those are the enemies of the American people.